Ready when you are, Chelsea.
Excellent. Thanks, Sam. Good morning, everyone. My name is Chelsea Keenan, and I'm a Secretariat Officer in the central team of the UK National Preventive Mechanism, and I'd like to thank you for attending the launch of our new preventive guidance today. Before we begin, I'll go through some housekeeping. So for the next hour, we'll hear from 9 distinguished speakers who have diverse backgrounds and experiences related to preventive monitoring. If you have questions during the talk, we'll ask you to please share them in the chat, and we'll keep track of them, and then we'll address them in a Q&A session at the end. We've turned off all of your cameras by default, and we've muted your microphones. Jane Kilpatrick from our team is in the background managing all of this, so thanks to Jane. And you should have been emailed a copy of the guidance, so that will be in your inbox, and it'll also be published on our website. And we will be recording today's session. Without further ado, I'll invite Sam Gluckstein to kick off the launch. Sam is a human rights lawyer and the head of the UK National Preventive Mechanism. Previously, he was the human rights lead and inspector for HM Inspectorate of Prisons Scotland. He sits on the expert panel for the Republic of Ireland, Chief Inspector of Detention Designate, and is director of Just Right, which uses the law to defend and extend people's rights. Sam also acts as a strategic advisor to newly established international NPMs as they implement OPCAT. Welcome, Sam.
Well, thank you, Chelsea, and thank you to all of you for joining us this morning or this afternoon, whatever time zone you're in. We have quite an international audience today, and it's really brilliant to have you all with us. It's quite an exciting day. There's been quite a lot of work that has been building up to this launch and to producing this guidance. And so I really want to take some time to talk through why we did it and why it's relevant to our conversation today. I want to start because I'm aware these online webinars can sometimes feel a bit anonymous. As Chelsea said, the audience today have your mics and cameras off, but hopefully you'll have the chance to ask some questions. But we have over 100 people with us today, and I thought I'd just give you a bit of a flavour of the audience that we have with us. We've got NPMs from across the world. We've got global, international, and national preventive mechanisms, people carrying out scrutiny work of places of detention all across the world. We've got members from civil society. We've got UK monitors of places of detention. We've got academics, we've got colleagues from the Council of Europe, and we've got many other interested parties. So it's brilliant to have such a diverse audience and such a diverse and distinguished speaker panel as well. So thank you all for joining us. I'm going to give just a little bit of context about the UK National Preventive Mechanism. We're 21 statutory members and around 3,500 people carrying out the optional protocol for the Convention Against Torture's mandate. We were established in 2009. Although many of those bodies pre-exist the ratification of OPCAT. And I think that's part of the reason this project has been important, because when we first thought of the concept of proactive preventive-based monitoring, I think the conception of it in the UK context, at least, was relatively rudimental. It was the idea that people could enter places of detention unannounced at any point with complete liberty and almost catch ill treatment and torture in the act. And it's taken us, it's the 15th year of the NPM this year, and it's taking us to now to try and develop a bit more of a sophisticated understanding of what we mean by prevention and how that works in the context of closed institutions. What we've tried to do with this guidance is try to enunciate some of the key skills and issues of preventive-based scrutiny. And we've co-designed this guidance with monitors in the UK. And so you've received it today, and I hope you'll be able to take the time to digest it, give us feedback, use it, abuse it, plagiarize it in your own work. But what we really want is to understand the work that we're doing and the preventive element of it. And so as it's been co-designed, a lot of it has been just writing down what people already do. But it is, I think, the first enunciation of some of those principles. And we've collaborated really closely with Sarah Cooke and Rachel Murray, who I'm very grateful for their expertise and support. And we've also had some fantastic peer reviewers who have made the work so much better. And it really has been a collaborative piece of work. And so I'm grateful to all of you. I think I would just like to pause as well and recognise that yesterday was the International Day in Support of Victims of Torture and the 40th anniversary of the United Nations Convention Against Torture. And I think today marks an apposite time to reflect on our work as a national preventive mechanism, as a body to proactively prevent torture and ill treatment in place of detention. And I think, unfortunately, the work of NPMs globally and in the UK to proactively prevent torture and ill treatment is as relevant and essential today as it may have been, as it was 40 years ago. So we hope that this work will further upskill not only our own NPM, but NPMs globally, and ultimately improve treatment and conditions for those deprived of their liberty. The UK National Preventive Mechanism, which I have the absolute honour to lead, stands ready to provide support, advice, collaboration, creativity and strength, holding the state to account for agreed obligations. So with that, I will pause my remarks. Thank you all for your attendance today, and hand back over to Chelsea to introduce our lineup of speakers.
Thank you, Sam. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Alan Michell. He is the president of the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture, otherwise known as the CPT. Alan became a member in 2017 when he was elected as president in 2021. And Alan's past roles include head of prison healthcare in Scotland, commissioner of the Scottish Human Rights Commission, and chair of the Independent Prison Monitoring Advisory Group in Scotland. He has undertaken visits to prisons across the Council of Europe area, as well as in India, Kuwait, Russia, and South Africa. Thank you, Alan.
Chelsea, thank you very much for your warm words of introduction. On behalf of the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture, it is indeed my pleasure to be able to join colleagues today and to share with you a few introductory remarks. National preventive mechanisms are constructs wholly as an effect of the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. Torture is a word that evokes many responses, and certainly the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture, which has been working for over 34 years now, has carried out over 500 visits to places of deprivation of liberty across the Council of Europe member states. The word torture evokes strong responses whenever we go into a place of deprivation of liberty. And in that regard, when we operate on the ground, we tend not to mention the torture word too much, because if we mention torture, it gets people's backs up. And the immediate response is, of course, we don't torture anyone here. And thankfully, albeit there is no single agreed international definition of what torture is or is not, if we talk in our everyday language about the prevention of ill treatment and vis-a-vis the conditions of detention and the treatment of persons deprived of their liberty by staff, then we are in a position whereby we're open to a much clearer and less cautious dialogue with those member states. Sam mentioned the UK NPM. I, for a number of years, was part of that NPM when I was a commissioner with the Scottish Human Rights Commission. And the NPM models across the world are variable. They range from the Ombudsman model to the Ombudsman Plus model to what I think is the most complex model, and that is the model within the United Kingdom. And whenever I visit countries across the European region who are about to establish NPMs, I say, please do not follow the UK's example here. The UK model has many strengths, but it has many challenges. And one of the challenges is that the UK model in particular brings together existing agencies. It brings together largely inspectorates. And national preventive mechanisms, the mechanism itself is not an inspectorate mechanism. It's a mechanism designed to strengthen the safeguards in relation to the prevention of torture, the prevention of ill treatment. And I would commend all colleagues who are joining this call today to read very carefully what the UK NPM has produced. I've read it when it was first shared with me. I read it again yesterday. I think it provides a very useful basis for each of us involved in preventive monitoring to build upon our work. What I would say from the CPT's perspective is, do not be afraid as preventive monitoring mechanisms to ask awkward questions. Do not be afraid to be bold. It's only by talking to persons deprived of their liberty, talking to staff, recognising that places which offer decent environments and decent living conditions for persons deprived of their liberty offer decent working conditions and safe working conditions for staff in prisons, in stations, immigration centres, in psychiatric hospitals for those persons who are involuntarily hospitalised there, and for people held in social care homes. So in conclusion, I congratulate the UK NPM for the work that they have done, and I would commend their efforts to all national preventive mechanisms who are joining this webinar today. I think it's a great piece of work, but please, I would invoke us, please let us be bold and not be afraid to ask the difficult questions when we go to places of detention across the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan, for your reflections. Next, I'll introduce Chris Nissen. Chris is the chairperson for the South African Human Rights Commission and was elected as a member of the UN Subcommittee on Prevention of Torture, also known as the SPT, in 2023. He's the SPT country rapporteur for the United Kingdom, Poland, and Moldova. And Chris oversaw the implementation of OPCAT after it was ratified in South Africa in 2019, which included the establishment of the South African NPM. And prior to this, Chris was a member of the Western Cape Provincial Legislature and worked as a community organizer on human rights issues. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this this launch today. And, you know, as Sam said, you know, yesterday we celebrated the International Day of Solidarity in the prevention of torture, but also with those who have been tortured and those who are still being tortured and ill-treated in different places of deprivation of liberty. I shared yesterday my own experience of being tortured under the apartheid regime. That one night I was taken from my cell after staying in solitary confinement for a long time. I was taken from my cell and I was, you know, tortured and by the security police. And the next morning, one of the ordinary policemen who cleans up there, he said to me, I clean up your blood because I didn't want others to walk in your blood as a further degradation of who you are. So torture prevention for me is very key. And that's why when I joined the Human Rights Commission, that for me was where we were, that ill treatment and prevention of torture. And Ellen, you're correct that we must be bold. We must answer those questions. We must ask those questions, and we must go back and say, what have you done where this in winter, cold water, -3 degrees, there's cold water ill treatment, or, you know, or where the food doesn't come, and all of those kind of things. And these are the kind of issues that we also talk now at this conference, because in the South, in Africa, we really have many challenges from, you know, from resources. And many states have, you know, signed the convention, but when it comes to implementation of the NPMs, there are no resources and so on. But in terms also of this guidance document, it is very helpful. It will help us. And Ellen, unfortunately, part of our NPM that we established in South Africa has been based on the model that we've learned from the UK. So, but again, we need to look at it, and the APT were very helpful with us in this regard. So we congratulate you on this guidance document. If you don't mind, with your permission, I would actually also give it to the NPMs who are the African network, so that they also can have a look at it. I went through it. I find it very helpful, and with all the comments that are coming to it, and you know, as we also celebrate the 40th year of CAT, UN CAT in it, and so on. So as the family, global family of preventers, as Ellen called us, as preventers, let us congratulate the UK NPM and thank you for that. And I've also asked that we will continue our relationship with the South African NPM with you. But on behalf of the SPT, may I congratulate you, and may this document, that the guidance document, that it also be integrated into the work of the SPT, and the SPT continues to stand with you in support of the work that you're doing, and will always be there. Although sometimes we need robust discussions, but we are there to support you in the execution or as a preventer of ill treatment, of torture, and etc. And so I think it will help all of us, but on behalf of the SPT, continue to do what is best, what we best to do, prevent torture, ill treatment, degrading, and cruel punishment. And so that we are criticized, you know, in my country, we are criticized, why are you looking after criminals? You know, and say, yeah, you know, but people who are in detention, especially those who've been sentenced, but even any person in detention has got the right to dignity. And us preventing torture is to protect that dignity of that person. That person will ultimately do, you know, get what, you know, in terms of the court procedures and so on, but we are there to prevent. And thank you so much for us, but on behalf of the SPT once again, and to all the whole family of preventers, as we celebrate yesterday, let us continue to do what we best do, and that is to hold authorities accountable where they keep people in deprivation of liberty. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Chris, for those reflections and for sharing your personal story with us as well. Next, I'm happy to introduce Ben Buckland. Ben is a senior advisor at the Association for the Prevention of Torture, or the APT. He's worked in human rights for more than a decade and combined this work with his love of photography. He's an award-winning human rights, humanitarian, and nature conservation photographer, and he tells important stories through his images. Recently, Ben joined Sam Gluckstein in Australia, where they delivered a 3-day workshop to the Australian NPM. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you so much. I'm just so glad to have been invited by the NPM to review this guidance on behalf of APT, and during the process, and then also to be able to speak here with a really absolutely brilliant group of panelists and people. And of course, huge thanks to you, Chelsea, Jane, Sam, and the whole team of the NPM. And I feel like doing this kind of thing is one of the ways that I feel my bit of APT can be most useful as a kind of quiet friend of NPMs, or maybe a really niche call center, a place that NPMs can kind of come confidentially for advice and thinking outside of the institution. But I think prevention, and kind of zoom out a little bit, is about going beyond what's on the surface, going past the events that we might see, someone being restrained without proper documentation or placed in long-term seclusion or whatever else it is, and digging down to questions about processes and patterns that drive and underpin these problems, and understanding the structures that influence those patterns, and also at the deepest level, the kind of mental models that guide these behaviors. But then ultimately, prevention is about change and about driving change in what are really complex systems. And it's this change element that I want to focus on, because to me, this work in the UK, these guidance documents are an example of how I think in recent years, we've seen some of the oldest NPMs in existence doing what I think is some of the deepest and most innovative thinking about how they can do just that, how they can drive change. here in the UK with this guidance that sets out just, I think, a really important basis for cross-institutional work. And then, of course, the other really huge pieces of work you're doing around recommendations and then around NPM coordination and decision-making. But then other examples of old NPMs in New Zealand, their focus on barriers to change within the Department of Corrections that oversees the prisons that they're looking at. In the Maldives, another really old NPM, having a really innovative approach to understanding what they've changed over the past decades and also building tools to be able to do a better job of tracking how they're making change going forward. Or in Chile, where the NPMs started using really careful strategic litigation to try and drive change in relation to Indigenous people under arrest by the police. And to me, these are all really extraordinary examples of how even after more than a decade, there's just still so much creativity and really intelligent thinking among these institutions that could have just kind of got into a track of doing the same thing year after year. And really trying to think about how they can continue to fulfill the really ambitious goals of the OPCAT. And then finally, in closing, I just I think underline one of the further strengths of the OPCAT system and a place where as APT we're really proud to play a role. And that's in this kind of international sharing of these ideas and practices among NPMs, because already I know that these ideas that are in this guidance from the UK are influencing what's happening in other multiple body NPMs. In Australia, for example, where Sam was valuable in joining us in sharing his experiences just recently, or last week, for example, in the first ever meeting of Asia Pacific NPMs, where we were referring to these tools and approaches with those NPMs, or in Belgium, which I think might actually challenge you for having the most complicated NPM model, where they're setting up their vastly complicated institution, but where the lessons that you've gained were also things that we shared with them, and I think are really helpful and influential in helping them take the first steps. So enormous thanks again to Sam, the whole UK NPM team, and to everyone else speaking today. Really looking forward to the Q&A as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben. And thanks for sharing so many interesting stories from international NPMs. That was nice to hear. Next, I am happy to introduce Sarah Cooke, OBE. Sarah is one of the two consultant collaborators who works on the preventive guidance, along with Rachel Murray, who we'll hear from next. Sarah is a lawyer and consultant specializing in human rights, mental health and social care, detention settings, and strategic organizational development. She's also a judge on the Mental Health Tribunal, and she previously worked with the Mental Health Act Commission, Care Quality Commission for 4 years, monitoring places of mental health detention. She was also chief executive of the British Institute of Human Rights for 7 years. Welcome, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Chelsea, and just fantastic to see so many people here today. So as Chelsea said, I'm one of the two authors of these reports and just have a few minutes to try and highlight some of the substance of what they cover, which is quite a challenge, as you can imagine. But what I've chosen to do is just highlight 4 areas which I think are particularly important and worthy of focus in this talk. So the first is the crucial importance of strategic leadership within monitoring organizations to really set the context and support mechanisms for preventive visiting to become a reality. And of course, this is why we chose to do one of the reports specifically focused on leaders and managers within scrutiny bodies. And so what we mean by that is really putting human dignity and worth and the rights of people at the heart of organizational mission and strategy. So that will ensure that the processes and the methodologies of those organizations reflect this focus on prevention of ill treatment. And it should include things like providing the right sort of recruitment and indeed training on an ongoing basis for monitors that reflects a preventive approach. And also, very importantly, in my view at least, really allowing a space for reflection and feedback for monitors and inspectors so they can raise and air their concerns about detention environments and really guard against a process that is too checklist driven or too mechanistic, really giving that kind of space for people to talk and raise their concerns. The second area that I've chosen to highlight is a simple point really, but just to say preventive monitoring is not an add-on. So we're not talking about undertaking specialist preventive visits. The approach, the sort of holistic approach we're talking about, needs to be mainstreamed in the work of monitors and inspectors. It needs to really shape and inform the way visits are undertaken. Which sort of leads me to my third point, which is to sort of try and understand and think about, reflect on the broad range of skills that are needed within the team of monitors and inspectors to undertake this kind of holistic approach to preventive visiting. So these are sometimes called soft skills. I don't particularly like that terminology, but anyway, soft skills are focused on how you undertake the work of visiting. And I think a couple of people, I think Ben just mentioned something in this area, and a couple of speakers before him. So this includes things like, you know, professional curiosity, really exploring and proactively trying to understand what is happening, including when environments are very familiar due to regular visiting. I know the normalization that can happen when you go back to a setting time after time after time. Things like professional courage, so really voicing opinions when going against the majority or established view. I think what's been mentioned as being bold, and that's part, and this was mentioned quite a bit by NPM organisations that we spoke to. Another area is interpersonal skills, really listening actively, understanding and empathising with others and taking people with you, really important part of the skill set needed. Another, tenacity, keeping pursuing the point you're concerned about, even if at first they seem minor or perhaps irrelevant, really kind of facing and handling the challenges and escalating when necessary. Another area is attention to detail. So, and again, I think this has been mentioned already, but looking closely at all the data and evidence, really being thorough and accurate, identifying patterns of behaviour, spotting evidential weaknesses and gaps, and following them up where appropriate. And the last one I've picked out, there are a number of these soft skills in the report, and I'm just highlighting a few, but the last one I'm going to pick on is self-awareness, that sort of insight into yourself, the ability to understand your own biases and assumptions, managing emotions, aligning your behavior with internal values, and understanding issues from multiple perspectives, trying to put yourself in the shoes of others. So there are a few of the kind of soft skills that we've highlighted in the report. And the last area I'm going to just talk about is just perhaps bringing a focus to where the risk of ill treatment might be heightened even beyond the vulnerabilities by virtue of being detained. What are the additional things that might make people particularly at risk? So I've chosen 4 areas to think about there. One is looking at the organisational culture, or indeed subcultures, within a detention environment. And we talk a lot about this in the report, but what we mean by organisational culture is the sort of shared values or attitudes, beliefs, informal, formal systems within an organisation that can lead to behaviour that really infringes the dignity of the detained population and might be a risk for ill treatment. It's really important, and in the report we raise a number of questions to try and explore that area. Second area here is perhaps bringing a focus to people who might be at heightened risk of detention due to many factors, such as age, state of physical health or mental health, nationality, language skills or lack of them, prior experience of trauma, neurodiversity, lots of issues, many of which might intersect, that will heighten the risk of ill treatment for certain people. The third area in this area is really focusing on moments in the detention process or journey that people experience where they might be at heightened risk of ill treatment. So that might include the early phase of detention, when people are first apprehended or where they're brought to a detention environment, when people are perhaps transferred between detention environments where often it's treated more as a logistics business than a kind of person-centered business. And perhaps also looking at where people are being deported or removed from the country, all parts of the detention journey where people may be at heightened risk. And then the last point that I'd raise in this area is also bringing a focus to practices which raise the risk of ill treatment. So an example of that might be where there's a use of force, where restraint is being used, or segregation or isolation, where people are searched, that might be their rooms or their own person, and where there's a use of sanctions or disciplinary measures. So listen, a very, very whistle-stop tour of just a few of the points that are in the guidance. I do commend you to look at it in full. It's been thought about very carefully, and we really, really felt privileged to be involved in it. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's really nice to hear you highlight some of the points as one of the authors. I will remind everyone in the audience that you can start putting your questions into the chat if they come up, and then we'll address those in the Q&A in just a few minutes. Next, we'll hear from Rachel Murray. Rachel is Professor of International Human Rights Law at the University of Bristol and Director of its Human Rights Implementation Center. She also has her own consultancy practice. Rachel undertakes regular work on OPCAT and torture prevention and the implementation of human rights law. Among her many distinguished posts, she's a Fellow of the Human Rights Center at the University of Essex, Global Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Notre Dame London Law School, and Deputy Leader of the Doughty Street Chambers International Team. Welcome, Rachel.
Good morning, afternoon, and maybe evening to everyone. So I'm going to just very briefly outline our methodology and how we came up with these documents. So the first thing we did was we started with desk-based research, looking at what documents were already out there, what guidance might already be available. So obviously APT, CPT, SPT reports and so on, as well as any guidance or documents from the UK NPM members themselves. Then we had a bit of a think amongst ourselves as a team as to what we understood to be a preventive approach. And we started to identify the sort of key elements, many of which have come up. Sarah's highlighted a number of these. So things like risk factors, cultural context, patterns, trends, and also those other skills that may be less visible that Sarah explained. And importance of sort of perceptions and where things just don't feel right. And then thinking, how do we capture that, all of these elements in a document, as well as lines of communication between those who are out there monitoring and inspecting in places of deprivation of liberty, and how they then feed those back up to leaders and managers and those involved in sort of strategic direction of the NPM. And we considered that a human rights-based approach underpinned everything. We initially thought we would just have one document, but then it became apparent that actually there was a need for a document for those monitoring and inspecting themselves, as well as those within positions of leadership and sort of determining strategic direction. But obviously, I mean, if you've looked at the documents, you'll see there's quite a bit of overlap between them. We also needed to recognise that there's a wide variety of NPMs in the UK, lay, professional, covering a range of different settings. And so we tried to design the guidelines so they had a relevance to all of those audiences. We sought initial information from NPM members who responded by email, and then we followed up with interviews with those who took out visits on the ground, as well as those within leadership roles. And a part of that was to try and identify existing good practice. And just a special thanks to all of you who engaged with us. And then finally, we shared our guidance with not only the NPM members, but then also sent a sort of near final-ish version to a peer review group, and then made any necessary changes accordingly. And again, thank you all to the peer review group for their really invaluable input. So I just want to say a personal special thanks to Sam and Sarah, particularly Sarah, for being such a wonderful team to work with. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, for giving us that insight into all the work that went into producing this guidance. Next, we're going to hear from 3 speakers who will operationally apply the new guidance in their monitoring work across the UK. First, I'm happy to invite Claire Taylor. Claire is the Independent Custody Scheme Manager for the Office of Sussex Police and Crime Commissioner. Claire has 18 years of officer experience with Sussex Police, working at the strategic, tactical, and operational levels. And she also has many years of safeguarding experience from her work in the private and charitable sectors. She's passionate about driving continuous improvement and upholding standards through collaboration, forward thinking, and creativity. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you, Chelsea, and thank you to the NPM for the invitation to speak and reflect on the new toolkit. Like many others, I feel very privileged that the scheme has been selected to be part of the launch and that we're able to share our reflections with you today. In opening, I wasn't going to use this word, but Sam did, so I'm going to take my lead from him. I'm very professionally excited about the launch of the toolkit. My excitement is on different levels. I'm professionally excited to share the content with our dynamic and proactive scheme of independent monitors, who I know will be tenacious in embracing the strategic prevention direction and continuous improvement of the toolkit, and then to see how those improvements play out in improving the experiences of those in police custody and those working in police custody. So I'm aware of the international audience. I'll just give you a very brief overview of the scheme in Sussex. We are a county in South East England, and the 2021 census showed we had a population of 1.7 million people. Within the county, Sussex Police detain approximately 2,000 people a month. And in terms of structure, our scheme sits within the Police and Crime Commissioner's office. So we're independent of Sussex Police and we sit outside, and that's how the accountability function works. Within the NPM, we sit within the Independent Custody Visiting Association, who we work very closely with and who have been instrumental in helping us to achieve the results that we've been able to achieve recently. So we are a scheme of independent monitors, or independent custody visitors, ICVs. We currently have 46 across the county, and they're recruited on the basis that they either live or work in the county, the diversity of the scheme being reflective of Sussex. We have 5 custody centres, a total of 110 cells, and each centre has a designated team or panel of independent custody visitors, with each panel being led by a coordinator and deputy coordinator. All of our volunteers bring very fresh eyes and a unique lens through which to monitor police custody. And during the last 4 years, certainly that I've been in post, the dynamics of the scheme, the collaboration with Sussex Police and leadership of the Independent Custody Visiting Association, we've secured a range of local and national improvements to custody. Now we have the toolkit. I'm very, I will use that word again. I'm very excited to see how we're going to be able to take our work to an even higher level. So policing, as you know, is a very dynamic risk environment influenced by political, social and economic factors. And for us, I really feel that the toolkit provides an anchor within such a fast-paced safeguarding environment of custody and detention. The NPM mission statement and strategic objective of prevention is very clear in both toolkits. So that's the toolkit for the managers and the leaders and also the frontline staff. And it brings together the skills and expertise of 21 human rights organisations, which is access to expertise that we will be very keen to embrace. It sets very high standards of visiting across custody and detention settings to ensure that we deliver on our responsibilities on behalf of the Police and Crime Commissioner. It really formalises our work through a prevention lens at each of the 3 levels that other speakers have spoken about. So in terms of the strategic level, it provides for a human rights approach and, as Sarah said, a context in which to set our infrastructure and collaboration with the police force. On a tactical level, I'll be embedding it within the recruitment, induction and training of the team to ensure there's a clear understanding of the prevention objective, and that's the foot on which we lead. And in terms of our responsibilities in delivering the role for rights, entitlements and welfare of those detained. On an operational level, the toolkit drills down even further to provide daily processes for visits, cell discussions and securing the voice of the detainee, which is a really important part of what we do, and to allow us to have reporting forms and meetings which are designed to prompt that feedback and review the identification of risk, the possible slippage. I think Sarah again spoke about desensitisation and normalisation of poor practices, dignity concerns, and also celebrating the good practice that we see within the scheme. So in closing, the value of the toolkit within our scheme in Sussex will be significant. The expertise from the 21 NPM members or organisations has been shared to deliver a high quality framework and good practice across monitoring and inspection, which impacts on those 3 levels that I've highlighted, and over time will provide for a much more complete picture of the risks, trends and emerging themes.
Thank you so much, Claire. We look forward to hearing how you get on with the guidance and any feedback that you have. Next, we'll hear from Neil Hart. Neil is an independent custody visitor in Sussex who regularly visits police detention centres. Before his retirement in 2016, Neil worked as a solicitor, specialising in corporate law. And since retiring, he's taken on many voluntary positions and is the trustee of several charities and not-for-profit organisations. Neil has also been a Deputy Lieutenant of the County of West Sussex since 2012 and was High Sheriff on the county in 2021. Welcome, Neil.
Thank you, Chelsea. I'm very honoured indeed to be asked to share my thoughts on the guidance. But first of all, I'm going to talk to you about what we actually do. I'm one of the guys on the ground, so let me share my experiences first on that, and then I'm going to talk about how the guidance will help us do the job that we're asked to do. So I'm an independent custody visitor. I'm part of the scheme that Claire has just described to you. We visit detainees in police custody in the 5 custody suites in our visits are unannounced at any time of the day or night, and we have the right to speak to detainees, and we do whenever possible. Sometimes they are unavailable to us because they're in an interview. Sometimes they're asleep. Sometimes they're not able to speak at all due to intoxication or other substance abuse. But wherever possible, we speak to the detainees to understand how they are being treated, how they feel about their custody experience. We observe the conditions of their detention, and we look at their custody records to find out how they've been treated. And following our visit, we submit a detailed report to Claire, our scheme manager. Do we make a difference? Well, I think we do. We're not there to check up on the custody staff. We are not inspectors. We are there to observe and to ensure the welfare of the detainees. And that's something that we always try to have at the front of our minds when we carry out our visits. But we also give the custody staff the benefit of an independent but informed view of how they are carrying out their very difficult job. And our observations over the years have led to a number of improvements in the care of detainees in police custody. In Sussex, for example, the levels of lighting in the cells has been amended as a result of our observations over the years. But turning to the guidance and how that will help us as independent custody visitors, well, the first thing I would say is it's relatively brief and it's very readable. And I thank all the authors for producing something which actually is very usable in my eyes. It first and foremost gives us a structure and a context of what we do, where we fit into the overall structure of the NPM, and where indeed the NPM itself sits in the overall structure of OBCAT. It has a number of very practical and useful suggestions of how we should approach our visits and the techniques that we should use. And it sets out the skills for the role, which I think are something that we should always bear in mind. And of course, that desire to be bold and to ask the difficult questions is emphasized again and again throughout the guidance, and something that we must always strive to do. The sections on over-familiarization and on organizational culture came as a bit of a shock to me, I have to say. I hadn't thought about those subjects before. Now I will have them in the front of my mind. and the guidance does explain how that becomes so much a danger in an organisation like police custody. It brings us back to the basic human rights standards, which is what we're all about in custody visitors. The section is on issues relating to detainees who are vulnerable, are particularly relevant to what we do in police custody, and bear a lot of thought on our part. So in short, I think it's required reading. I'm sure Claire, as our scheme manager, will have this out to us in pretty quick time. But it's required reading not only at the outset of our role of ICVs, but we constantly need to go back to read it and refresh our thinking in the context of what we do as custody visitors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. And thanks for letting us know how this guidance will support your work. That was nice to hear. Last of our speakers, but certainly not least, I'm happy to introduce now James Corrigan, Deputy Chief Inspector and Chief Executive of Criminal Justice Inspection Northern Ireland. James first joined CJI as an inspector when it was established in 2004, and today he's responsible for managing all inspectors and overseeing the conduct and completion of inspections across all parts of the criminal justice system in Northern Ireland, with the exception of the judiciary. Thank you very much, James.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you all today. And I suppose just to give you a little background on criminal justice inspection, we were established 20 years ago, and we came out of essentially the institutions and I suppose the post-conflict transformation of Northern Ireland. And we were a unique inspectorate because, as Chelsea said, we have a remit across all aspects of the criminal justice system except the judiciary, which means that actually we inspect not only the prisons, but also the Children's Juvenile Justice Centre. We inspect the transport of prisoners. We inspect police custody. We inspect court custody. And we do thematic inspections, which have elements of detention, but also have a clear linkage to NPM. So I suppose we're unique in that perspective. And also coming out of the conflict in Northern Ireland, we were set up with that human rights in our core because there was issues around and concerns around the contested nature of the criminal justice system, and particular concerns around detention and how people were treated in detention. So it was important that there was an independent inspectorate that was able to impartially inspect places of detention, to raise awareness among the public about what happens in our prisons and in our detention facilities, and to increase public confidence. So when the NPM came along, the UK NPM, and we were essentially there at the beginning in 2009, essentially it fitted into what our core DNA was like, because in a sense, our CGI and NPM essentially is part of the same sort of DNA. And essentially our priorities is around, we have a priority in our business plan, which is around better protecting and safeguarding. So essentially what I'm saying is that essentially the NPM is very much aligned, and we are aligned to our values and vice versa. So I want to, I suppose, maybe say a little bit now around more recent developments in terms of CGI, because we're obviously part of the UK NPM and there's 21 bodies, but in Northern Ireland there's 4 designated bodies. And then 2 years ago, we made the decision that we would set up a subgroup in Northern Ireland, partly maybe to deal with the complexity of the UK NPM, but also to reflect some of the local dimensions of the NPM in Northern Ireland. And we've seen it also as an opportunity to not only raise the profile of NPM in Northern Ireland, but also essentially to put more pressure on our local government, our executive, essentially around the protections and around the role of the NPM, and also to bring together the NPM bodies in Northern Ireland to work more collaboratively. So that's a new development, and one of our inspectors is the chair of that subgroup. So I think that's working pretty well. I want to also maybe, and a number of you talked about the guidance today in terms of managers and in terms of what that means for actually the inspectors to actually do the work. Just for a moment, I'll just focus on, well, what does the guidance mean to inspectors? As the Chief Executive, I'm responsible for appointing all and recruiting all inspectors. And I have to say that those soft skills that was mentioned today by Sarah and by Neil is actually fundamental to what the values that we look for in an inspector. And we're looking for somebody with that independence. We're looking for impartiality. We're looking for somebody with communication skills that are able to sort of communicate not only with other inspectors, but probably more importantly, actually with people who are held in detention, and make sure that the voice of people held in detention is actually reflected in our inspection reports. So when we recruit for inspectors, we make NPM actually a core part of the recruitment process, one of the core skills we're looking for. And when we do our training and we do our appraisal of inspectors, we actually appraise on the basis of NPM. And when it comes to this issue around over familiarization, we rotate our inspectors. So we would have an inspector maybe dealing with prisons for 2 or 3 years, but we then rotate to other inspectors and also in police custody. So essentially, we when I seen that in the guidance, I was thinking, well, actually, that's very, very important, and it's something that actually we do. And just finally, I just maybe give you a couple of examples around inspections that we're doing at the moment, which have, I suppose, particular relevance. One that we're doing, we've just done a month ago, was an inspection of the women's prison and young men's prison in Northern Ireland. And I think what was important about that inspection is it actually brought together 4 separate NPM bodies, because not only were we working with the regulator for health and social care in Northern Ireland, which is an NPM body, and we work closely with, obviously, with the Independent Monitoring Board who are in the prisons, but we also work with HM Inspectorate of Prisons from England and Wales who come across and work with us, alongside us, in that inspection. So that was an example of inspection where actually you had 4 NPM bodies working collaboratively together, sharing best practice, I suppose, thinking about standards, bringing in the local dimension in terms of what's important for Northern Ireland. So I think that's a good example of collaboration. And then just very briefly, just one other example, which was a piece of work that we done recently, which was requested by our Minister of Justice to look at the isolation units within the prison. Because those are areas which are particularly, I know people who are held in isolation units are particularly vulnerable. And we were the body that was selected by the Minister to actually examine, I suppose, the experiences of what's happening in those areas. And essentially, it was a very, very critical report. But I do believe that in terms of NPM and in terms of that inspection, actually, a lot of good things has come out of that inspection report. And that's when we think about, well, how do we make a difference? What's the impact? Well, the impact is actually when you see the improvement for people held in detention, and it may, in this case, it may be a small number of people, but actually, we believe our inspection, our recommendations, which were accepted, actually really make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Thanks for talking to us about how the NPM fits into CJI and about your collaborative approach with the other NPM bodies in Northern Ireland as well. So that brings us to our question and answer session. I see we have a few questions already in the chat that we'll start with, and please, I invite everyone in the audience to send your questions through and we will try and get to them. So the first question is from Linda Allen, and I think this question is best to put to Sarah and Rachel. And she's asking, how were the direct experiences, voices, and expertise of those deprived of their liberty, family members, etc., sought during the development of the new guidelines? And do you feel confident this expertise is reflected in the final publication?
Rachel, do you want to take it or shall I? Rachel? Shall I? Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, go first, and I'll come in whichever you want.
Sure. I think it's fair to say actually that, this piece of work is to some extent a limited piece of work. So, it had a kind of relatively limited scope in terms of consultation. So I think it's a fair point to say we would have liked to have consulted more broadly, because I think you make a good point in that voice is really important. If not crucial. In fact, we did try and capture that to some extent by our in-depth discussions with NPM members who do meet with detained people on a regular basis. But I think it kind of links, I think, to your next question. I think you asked a follow-up question about evaluation and judging success of the work. I would say that I mean, I guess it's not for me to say actually to some extent, because it's for the UK NPM to decide, but I would say this isn't, you know, you need to think of this guidance as a living document. You know, it's not set in stone. It's something that needs to be reviewed, and ideally those broader perspectives would be captured on review, as hopefully, you know, there's more funding for the work and more time given to the work. So I don't think this is a kind of full stop at all. I think the broader perspectives should be sought and reflected in future versions of the guidance, and I very much hope that's what will happen. Rachel, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, agree with everything that you've just said. I think, I mean, there are obviously challenges and sensitivities of speaking with those who've been deprived of their liberty anyway. Our focus was on producing guidance for NPM, those who do the visits and sort of leadership themselves. And in fact, one of the difficulties we had was, you know, even the term preventive is a bit clunky. It raises not dissimilar to sort of conversations that was mentioned initially about, you mentioned the word torture and ill treatment. And I think there's sort of misunderstanding, what does actually this mean? And it can end up being a rather abstract discussion. I think we did try, and I absolutely appreciate that it does, you know, could be perceived as a gap, and absolutely this is, you know, hope that these documents can be revised and reflected on, and if there are gaps and omissions then and weaknesses, that they can be amended. But I think we did look at, you know, a range of documents and materials that were already out there, including reports produced by NPM members who themselves obviously have spoken to detainees. So I don't think their voice is completely neglected or ignored, but they weren't a cohort that we spoke to directly. But there could have been many others that we would have liked to have spoken to beyond the NPM members. That was our focus, if there had been sort of time and resources to do so.
Thank you, Sarah and Rachel. So Linda, you had a follow-up question, as mentioned, which is how will we measure the success of the new guidelines? And Sarah, you spoke to that a bit. Sam, did you want to speak to that as well before we move to the next question?
Sure, maybe I can roll in measuring success and Jane's question about where is the voice of the NPM and how do we get these issues heard. Measuring success is a really tricky one, because as a preventive body, we're measuring something that we've prevented, which is always difficult. And I think that while it may be seen as a success to go into a place of detention and find something terrible that has happened, the actual real success of this guidance will be not finding something terrible. It will be knowing that we have robust systems in place, robust scrutiny models that are able to prevent ill treatment and torture in place of deprivation of liberty. From a practical perspective, the measuring of success will see this guidance influence the standards and methodologies of NPM members, both in the UK and globally. And we think that they have really something useful to add to the toolkit of methods that scrutiny bodies, NPM bodies, do when examining a place of detention. So if we're able to see this guidance influence the thinking, influence the recruitment, as James mentioned, influence the practicalities, even if they are a reminder of things that inspectors and monitors already know, I think that will be one step to a good success. And to Jane's point around where is the voice of the NPM, you know, we're in an election period and criminal justice isn't as much of an issue, and the IMB is struggling to be heard. I would say that I absolutely hear those frustrations, that the role of the NPM is to pull multiple levers in many directions to try to influence change, to get the agenda, to get the issues on the agenda of decision makers. And the NPMs are the voice for some of the most vulnerable people in society. And it's important that we keep doing that work, keep making their voices heard, and keep bringing these issues to the national agenda. We are taking, in the case of the Independent Monitoring Board, Jane, I know you're from Feltham, and on the basis of your findings, the NPM reads every board annual report, every finding, and we take those findings collectively across our 21 members, across the 3,500 people carrying out this work, and we represent that both at domestic and international level. So, for example, findings from the IMB influenced our report to the ICCPR in Geneva just this year, and the concluding observations from that UN committee have gone to government and put it on the agenda. And while there isn't a silver bullet to get these issues fixed, continuously highlighting them, bringing their voices to the foreground and doing the work of scrutiny and prevention, I think is essential. So I hope that's somewhat of an answer to that question as well, Chelsea.
Thank you, Sam. I think we'll just take one more question and then we'll close the session. So Rebecca asks, any practical tips or techniques that can be used on visits to calibrate balance between digging deep into data and information and reflecting on higher level issues at places of detention, such as culture? So I think that anyone really in the group could answer that one from your own perspectives. Would anyone like to volunteer? No, I know Ben Buckland, he had to go to a meeting right at 11:30, so he is interested in getting in contact with you, Rebecca, about that. But
I'll say I just think it's a great question because and Rebecca, thank you for joining us. I'm sure it's late at night where you are, so it's great that you've come. Thank you. I just think you've highlighted such a difficult issue. I don't really have any kind of answers to it because, of course, both need to happen. And I just wondered whether it's something about also gathering information over time. So it's about what happens at the visit, but also about collating that picture over time and looking at the detention environment, particularly the culture things, as a sort of an ever-evolving picture and keeping that up to date. So it's not just the balance within a visit. It's about undertaking both those sorts of roles, the digging deep and the broader reflections over a kind of longitudinal timepiece. But I mean, I think it's a really good question. It's difficult and I don't have any easy answers. Maybe someone can offer something more helpful, but there you go. That's my 2 pennies.
Anyone else to add anything right now? We had a few questions that didn't go answered in the chat, so we've saved those questions and we will get back to you via email, and Rebecca will connect you with Ben as well because I know he wanted to speak more to your question. But I'll close the Q&A session as we're a couple minutes over, and I will invite Sam Gluckstein to the floor to close the webinar.
Well, thank you, Chelsea, and thank you, everyone. It really has been a delight to have speakers. I'm sorry our Q&A and our discussion was cut short, but I think the discussion from the speakers was fascinating. I don't really have a huge amount to close other than to say that this isn't the end of this piece of work. It is very much the beginning, and we're excited to have your feedback, your comments, your criticisms, your expertise in this, and the people that will use this work, or the people that will be around this work or interested in it. We really want to hear from you, and as Sarah said, is a living document. The second thing I'll say is that I'm going to have Neil's quote, "It's required reading," put on the front of the document, and I really hope that we're able to get this required reading on the kind of training and coursework of all monitors in the UK and globally. I'll thank all of our participants this morning, all of our speakers, all of you for attending and being interested in this work, and for, I know we have many monitors in the group, and for the work you do as well, it's vital. So thank you very much. It's a real delight to be with you all, and I hope we will continue the conversation through the long term. Thank you very much, and have a good rest of your day.